Hello, my name is Tyler Myers, and I will be presenting about open source software today. So here's the agenda. I will cover what is open source software, why it is important. I will go over a brief history of it, and I will also talk about where it is today. Then I will continue on to talk about some examples of open source software, the impact of it, give a few advantages and disadvantages of it, and then I'll conclude with the future and my conclusion. So what is open source software? Well, you can see the definition right below the slide title, but a little more of an in-depth description is a software that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. It basically allows programmers to improve programs by adding or fixing parts to it. Along with that, it also affects the way people use software. The open source licenses promote collaboration and sharing because of the ability of users to modify it. This basically sums up what open source is. So now, why is it important? Well, it is important for three big reasons. The first is it promotes collaborations, which in turn helps develop new technologies. Then it helps improve the technology that has been previously developed. The second is it improves programming as it allows for anyone to enhance the files, which in turn results in a boost in programming. And the final is it shares knowledge. Due to its open nature, it allows information to be shared easily and freely, and as a result, the whole community benefits from it. Now I'll move on to the history of open source software. So the person who started the free software movement, which eventually led to open source software, is Richard Stallman. And he asked himself a simple question: what does society need? His answer to this was it needs information that is truly available to its citizens. A large part of that is the freedom to software. And as a way to achieve this, in 1984, Stallman created the GNU project. So the GNU project, as I said, was created in 1984 to create a free operating system. This goes back to Stallman's idea that software should be free. The following year, the Free Software Foundation was created to house money for this project, so in 1985. They controlled 4 rules to define whether a program is free. And these 4 rules can be seen right here. The first is run the program as you wish. The second, modify the program to fit your needs. The third is redistribute copies. And the fourth is distribute modified copies to the community. So if a software is free, the user must have the ability to do all 4 of these. And so open source today. It is a large industry as its valuation jumps over $1 billion, and that is obviously a lot of money. So this being said, JFrog, a large company involved with open source, actually just secured a $165 million investment, which just shows where the movement is going as more and more investments are being secured each month and year. This, along with the possible merge of 2 main foundations that deal with JavaScript, will create the future of open source programming for years to come. Now I'll move on to some examples. Firefox, which I believe most people know, is an open source web browser that competes with Internet Explorer. You'll see a lot of products here which you may not recognize but compete with larger projects that you most likely will recognize. One such example is OpenOffice. And OpenOffice competes with Microsoft Office. The only difference is OpenOffice is an open source program, but also rather than competing, they may be included in a product. A great example of that is GIMP. GIMP is a graphic tool which features in Photoshop. So you can use little different features of GIMP in Photoshop, and it's an open source software. And here I'll move on to some more examples. Zimbra is the first one. Zimbra is an open source email server who competes with Outlook. As I mentioned a little bit before in the first slide, or in the slide ahead of this, Microsoft, which controls Outlook, is a closed software, so it's closed source software, which is CSS, and that means it's not open to the public. The second example is Sugar CRM, and this is an open source customer relationship management software. The third example is MarketCetera, or Cetera, and it is an enterprise trading platform for hedge fund managers. And then finally, there's Sun's Open Solaris, which is an open source version of the Unix operating system. So now I'll go on to the impacts of open source software. So there's two main impacts for open source programming or open source software. The first is they pose a severe threat to closed source programming companies as they are consistently improving. I spoke a little bit about Microsoft before, and that's a perfect example, as Microsoft is indeed a closed source software. So you can see that several open source software companies are threading their future as it appears that more and more programs are going towards open source software. And this leads me to my second impact of software, which is improving every day. This is due to the fact that it is open to everyone, so it is constantly being adapted with so many minds working on it. And that kind of goes back to my point of how anyone can modify or improve open source software. That's a big advantage, which I'll get to in the next slide. So now that I'm done with the impact, I'll go on to some advantages of open source software over the next two slides. The first is the flexibility of open source technology because it allows for problems to be solved in multiple ways. This goes back to how anyone can modify, create, or edit any open source software. Another advantage is caused by this is speed. As a result of the ability to take community versions, companies are able to start up quickly and inexpensively, and also they're able to quickly develop new technology because of so many minds working on different problems and projects. And this leads to the next advantage of cost effectiveness. This is basically the same as I just talked about because of the flexibility. There's companies are able to start off generally quickly and inexpensively. So I'll go on to talk about a couple other advantages. So the last few advantages are security, involvement, and the talent. So open source security has a good track record in the past, and it is expected to continue so in the future. And that's just because it is generally at the level of closed source software, so there's no big jump, but at the same time it's no risk using open source software. And then the level of involvement is also an advantage, as you can have multiple people working on solving a problem at any given time. That goes again back to how people are able to modify different programs. And finally, it attracts better talent, as most professional technologists believe this is where the future is headed. And I'll talk a little bit more about the future in a couple slides. But for now, I'll move on to the disadvantages, although there aren't that many, honestly. So the first is difficulty of use. This comes with pretty much all technology, as generally in technology, there are always going to be programs or applications that are not user-friendly, and the same applies to open source applications, as not all are user-friendly. The second is compatibility issues, as most programs need specialized drivers to run, and this is becoming less and less problematic as more open source servers are being adapted. And the final is liability, as most open source programs have only limited warranties and no liability protection. This is just because obviously a company cannot take sole control over open source projects, so due to that, they are not able to give out any liability insurance or anything of that type. So now I'll move on to the future. And these are three large reasons why open source software is the future when matched up against closed source software. The first explains itself, as I've mentioned multiple times throughout this presentation. It generally, open source software is inexpensive, and proprietary software, which is closed source, is a lot more expensive. The second and third go along with the ability for anyone to modify the software. As a result of this, it is constantly innovating and adapting, and so that goes perfectly with development, and obviously, as it states in the slide, it's easily innovative. And so now I'll continue on to the actual future of open source software. Many people believe it will continue to grow at crazy rates, as it is expected that open source software will reach an even wider audience in the coming years. I actually searched online for this and found a little article with many experienced technologists kind of opinions on open source software, and almost all of them were positive in saying that they think that open source software will easily outgrow closed source software in the coming years, and they did believe that Microsoft could be in trouble. And it was also explained in my ITM class that Microsoft is actually worried about open source software, so this just kind of goes along with that. It is also expected that OSS, or open source software, will be a key driver of innovation, and this goes back to as the recurring topic of how people can modify different files without needing extra permissions, and so because of this, innovation will be a key factor in the future of open source software. And finally, it is expected to broaden its role and eventually taking over completely, and so that goes back to the fact of Microsoft and how it is expected that open source software will be solely the future, and will eventually phase out closed source software, CSS. And so now I'll go on to my conclusion slide. So here's my conclusion slide. So we basically began talking about what is open source. I gave a definition. I explained why it is important nowadays, and then after that I carried on to speak about the history of open source, where it was founded, who founded it, and gave a little bit about the GNU project. Following that, I went on to talk about open source today and some of the recent news. I talked about the big investment, the current evaluation of how the market for open source software, etc. And then I went on to talk about some examples of open source software. The most well known has to be Firefox. There were a couple others that may be known, but most of them were generally probably unknown for most people. outside of the programming world. And then I continued on to talk about the impact of open source software and some of the advantages and disadvantages. And the advantages did far outweigh the disadvantages. And then finally, I just wrapped up speaking about the future of open source software and where it's headed, which clearly the future of open source software is bright. So now I'll just conclude with here's my sources, first 4 and then the next 6. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.